Section 4 of Chapter 25 is titled The Changing Black Movement. We're going to focus on how the Civil Rights Movement changed in the mid-1960s. So pay attention to what you need to know for your test. The Civil Rights Movement entered a crisis when it moved from demanding access to schools, public facilities, and voting booths to economic disparities between blacks and whites. In the mid-1960s, economic problems became a civil rights priority. Violence in northern ghettos brought attention to racial injustice and inequalities in jobs, education, and housing, which the end of legal segregation didn't solve. The hostility of latter race relations emerged from many whites' beliefs that blacks had won equality in civil rights and voting rights laws and needed no further assistance, while blacks, aware of discrimination in jobs, education, and housing, and in the criminal justice system, called for more government action. And this will lead to a series of ghetto uprisings. You're going to need to know the Kerner Report, MLK's Chicago Freedom Movement, and the change in language during this time with regard to the Civil Rights Movement. The first riots, actually battles, between blacks and mostly white police erupted in Harlem, New York, 1964. The larger uprising of 1965 in Watts, the black ghetto of Los Angeles, saw 50,000 rioters attack police and firemen, loot white-owned businesses, and burn buildings. After the National Guard restored order, 35 had been killed, 900 injured, and $20 million in property destroyed. By the summer of 1967, urban riots seemed everywhere. Some feared racial war. Urban rebellions left 23 dead in Newark, New Jersey, and 43 dead in Detroit, huge parts of which were devastated. Johnson appointed a commission to study the causes of urban disorder, whose report blamed them on segregation and poverty. It indicted white racism and claimed that society was becoming harshly divided amongst racial lines. The Civil Rights Movement, knowing black unemployment was twice that of whites and that the average black family had little more than half the income of white families, moved to address economic freedom for black Americans. In 1964, King called for a Bill of Rights that would offer positive economic rights to African Americans, what would become later known as affirmative action. In 1966, he launched the Chicago Freedom Movement, demanding an end to discrimination by employers and unions, equal access to mortgages, the integration of public housing, and decentralized low-income housing. But King's movement was no match for the political machine of Chicago's Mayor Richard J. Daley and white homeowners who fiercely opposed him. King's nonviolent attacks failed in the North. King became more radical and started to call for a better distribution of wealth for all of God's children. Okay, so let's review very quickly what you need to know. You need to know the Kerner Report that blamed the violence in these ghettos, these uprisings, these riots, on segregation. They blamed it on poverty, and they indicted and put the blame on white racism. You need to know that. You also need to know that in 1966, MLK launched the Chicago Freedom Movement. And what were his demands as part of this movement? Demanded an end to discrimination by employers and by unions, asked for equal access to mortgages, asked for the integration of public housing, and for the construction of low-income housing scattered throughout the region, not in just one area, so you can keep them all together, spread them around. And then lastly, you need to know about the change in Martin Luther King's language. He himself became more radical, and he realized that it would be difficult to fight this economic fight. And that's where the fight changed. At first it was for rights. They have the rights. Now they're fighting for economic equality, for access. It's about access. It's about opportunity. They're not saying they're saying, give me a chance, open the door for me, let me walk through it, but give me that opportunity. And that's where Martin Luther King's language became more and more radical, demanding more. Okay, so make sure you know that. And so into the picture comes Malcolm X. You need to know about his thoughts on autonomy. If the early civil rights movement had clear objectives and profound accomplishments, the latter movement saw political fragmentation and very few victories. Even during the height of integration struggles, the incendiary orator, speaker Malcolm X insisted that blacks must control the political and economic resources of their own communities. That's autonomy. Auto means self. And again, I'm going to read this again. Malcolm X insisted that blacks must control the political and economic resources of their own communities and avoid working with whites. It's much like the difference between W.E. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey and some of these other African American leaders at the turn of the century. Some said integrate, some said stay separate. And here you have that difference. Malcolm X says they don't want us to be a part of their society. Let's form our own society. Named Malcolm Little when he was young, he committed several crimes, and Malcolm X converted in jail to the Nation of Islam, or black Muslims, who preached a message of white evil and black discipline. Malcolm dropped his slave surname in favor of X, symbolizing blacks' separation from African ancestry. Released from prison, Malcolm X became a spokesman for the Muslims and a vehement critic of the integrationism and nonviolence of King and of the civil rights movement. Unlike King, Malcolm X saw nothing redemptive in American values. On a 1964 trip to Mecca, Islam's spiritual center, Malcolm X saw interracial harmony between Muslims and moderated his message, embracing the possibility of interracial cooperation for radical change in America. But his assassination in early 1965 left no consistent ideology or organization behind. His calls for black independence inspired the urban poor and younger civil rights activists, and his 1966 autobiography became a bestseller. Okay? The next section, the rise of black power. You need to know about the rise of this militant group. Malcolm X was the father of Black Power, a slogan popularized by SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael in 1966 during a march in Mississippi. Black Power rallied those angry with the federal government's failure to stop violence against civil rights activists, white attempts to dominate the movement, and the movement's inability to influence the economic plight of urban blacks. Black Power suggested everything from electing more blacks to political office to the belief that blacks were a colonized people whose freedom could be won only through revolutionary struggles for self-determination. The idea reflected the radicalization of young civil rights activists and inspired cultural pride. The word Negro was abandoned for Afro-American, and African dress and hairstyles were celebrated. Previously, interracial civil rights groups like SNCC and CORE also repudiated their inclusion of whites, and they soon disintegrated. They fell apart. New groups sprang up, however, most prominently the Black Panther Party, formed in Oakland, California in 1966 to protest policy brutality. The Black Panthers won notoriety for advocating armed self-defense, and their militant stance on actions alarmed moderate blacks and many whites. Troubled by internal disputes and police, the FBI repression, the Black Panthers disintegrated by the early 1970s. So, what do you need to know about this section? You need to know that Black Power became a rallying cry for those who were bitter, angry, upset that the federal government failed to stop the violence against civil rights workers. Okay. They were also upset that whites were trying to take over the movement. They were trying to determine the direction the civil rights movement should take. And lastly, they were angry that the civil rights movement had failed to impact economic issues. Again, economic issues kind of became the center of the civil rights movement in the latter half of the decade. So again, let me review this really quick. The rise of black power came because civil rights workers were upset that the federal government was not doing anything to stop violence against them. They were upset that whites seemed to want to take over the movement, and they were upset that the movement was not addressing economic issues that African Americans were facing. Okay, so you need to know also that the rise of black power also kind of sparked this explosion of cultural pride amongst African Americans. This idea, the slogan, black is beautiful. We talked about it in class. Growing out your afro, wearing dashikis, these African style shirts and clothing. For some of them it meant converting to Islam. Okay. You need to know that the Black Panthers, a very specific group of black power, was founded in Oakland, California. That's in the second to the last paragraph of that section. And that the Black Panthers became quite famous because they proposed, they advocated, they supported using armed self-defense. They didn't necessarily go out and look for fights, but they certainly believed in fighting back with guns if you had to. So while Martin Luther King Jr. preached turn the other cheek, non-violent, the Black Panthers said, we don't necessarily believe in violence, but we will fight back if we have to. Okay. They also demanded the release of black prisoners because there was racism in the criminal justice system, and it's something we still deal with today in 2016. But the Black Panthers got a bad rap, and in some cases maybe it was deserved. There were always a few bad apples in any organization, but they also did some really good things for the community. They ran health clinics. They helped protect and open schools, and they set up children's breakfast programs. So they also did things within their community to help and uplift the community. And notice the things they did all reflect that kind of impact on the economic lives of their neighborhoods, of their people. Okay, and so the last image I'll leave you with for this section is of female students of Howard University, a historically black college in Washington, D.C. And again, you notice growing out your afros meant to accept your genes, if you will, and let your hair grow as it's supposed to naturally. Okay, so this is the end of that section. If you have any questions about this change in the civil rights movement, please feel free to contact me.